Oh, hello there and welcome to NAR. Genie Wiley. Chances are that you've heard of this name before. The child who grew up being abused by her father, the very man tasked with the key role of protecting, loving, and providing for her. When he failed and his disgusting abuse was uncovered, Wiley was sent to a children's hospital at 13 years old, and a team was tasked to study her because the abuse stunted her development. This was a rare case which could provide crucial knowledge on child development, especially language formation. Now that she was out of her father's abusive care, you'd think that, as people often say, things can only go up from here, right? Well, in this video, we will talk about what it means to be a feral child. We will talk about Genie's parents and touch a bit on their respective childhoods, which I think many people don't know about. We'll look at how the abuse unfolded and how it came to an end. We'll then discuss the Genie team, their crucial discoveries, but also their internal conflict which eventually led to the end of the case study. We'll look at Genie's life after the end of the study, and lastly, the other victim in all of this who literally got tossed aside and forgotten when everybody focused on Genie and her monster of a father. Now, as I said before, a lot of people already know of Genie's case, so it would be unfair for me to just state what's already known and leave it there. I will also focus on the important parts of the story which I feel were rarely covered by the documentaries and other YouTube videos, such as the failure of the Genie team and how the selfishness of certain members who are considered professionals led Genie into more torture. What I saw happen with Genie was a pretty crass form of exploitation. I had to realize that I was part of it and swear to refrain. It turned out that Genie, who had been so terribly abused, was exploited all over again. She was exploited extrafamilially just as she was exploited intrafamilially, just by a different cast of characters, of which I'm sorry to say I was one. So, what is a feral child? Wikipedia defines it as a young individual who has lived isolated from human contact from a very young age, with little or no experience of human care, social behavior, or language. They are sometimes the subject of folklore and legends, typically portrayed as having been raised by animals. While there are many cases of children being found in proximity to wild animals, there are no credible evidence for animals feeding or caring for children. Feral children lack the basic social skills that are normally learned in the process of enculturation. For example, they may be unable to use a toilet, have trouble learning to walk upright after walking on fours all their lives, or display a complete lack of interest in the human activity around them. They often seem mentally impaired and have almost insurmountable trouble learning a human language. It's crucial for you to understand this definition because it seems that when some people think of a feral child, they think of a human who grew up in the woods with wild animals. But truthfully, while such a person may be considered feral, it can even be someone like Genie who didn't really grow up with animals but was isolated from human contact most of their lives. So much so that in the end, they never developed the necessary social skills and language needed to help them survive independently within society. To begin with, did you know that Genie isn't even her real name? Susan Wiley was given the pseudonym Genie to help protect her identity because she was so young when her case became extremely popular that they had no choice but to protect her identity. This happens often when young individuals are involved in popular cases and their identities don't serve any importance. In terms of Genie's case, she was the main character and everybody wanted to know about her. Therefore, they couldn't hide her identity completely. The case name is Genie. This is not the person's real name, but when we think about what a genie is a creature that comes out of a bottle or whatever, but emerges into human society past childhood. We assume that it really isn't a creature that had a human childhood. Susan's parents were Clark Wiley and Irene Oglesby. Originally from Altus, Oklahoma, Irene was born around 1920. She was raised by her father and family friends as her mother was not the best mom. She was described as stern and unloving. Irene moved to Los Angeles, California with her family in search for a better life during the severe storms of the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was the name given to the drought-stricken Southern Plains region of the United States, which suffered severe dust storms during a dry period in the 1930s. As high winds and choking dust swept the region from Texas to Nebraska, people and livestock were killed and crops failed across the entire region. After moving to LA, her family was still struggling, though, thanks to the Great Depression, and around this time is when she met Clark, and she married him for financial freedom. But Irene would later admit that her life ended on her wedding day. See, Clark had a very rough childhood growing up. Most of the information I'm about to reveal about his childhood might be slightly modified for whatever reason, so take it with a grain of salt. I know a lot of people will watch this video to learn more about Genie's case, so I want to make it clear to you that the information I got about Clark Wiley's childhood wasn't from a very authentic source. I have not found any other source apart from this one which proves what I'm about to tell you. It may be true, but I just want to provide a bit of caution before people take it as fact. So, Clark Wiley was born on the 29th of March 1901 in Oregon. His birth name wasn't even Clark. His mother is said to have apparently given him a feminine name, Pearl. As you can already guess, Pearl Wiley was teased a lot for his girly name, which made him harbor lots of anger towards his mother throughout his childhood. This is believed to be the source of his later anger issues. Along with the gifting of an unfitting name, his mother wasn't the best of mothers either, something he had in common with Irene. Pearl's mother ran a brothel and was rarely around for her son. Pearl spent some of his childhood in orphanages because of this, and so she rarely saw him. His father was killed by a lightning strike, meaning that little Pearl was left feeling lonely and abandoned by a mother whom some might argue was just trying to be the breadwinner. But I'm sure most of us can agree that she should have spent more time with her son who had lost a father in a very tragic death. Again, apparently Pearl grew up like this until he was able to change his name to a more manly Clark. When he met Irene, he was unemployed but then later found a job as a flight mechanic during World War II, where he made a decent amount of money. Then they got married. I am not sure when, but at some point Irene sustained a head injury which caused her to go blind to a certain extent. This left her fully dependent on her husband, who would abuse this power. Clark was extremely controlling and overprotective of Irene. In hindsight, probably a sign of the worst to come. Clark Wiley hated children as they were noisy and stressful. He is said to have never wanted children, but it seems like he didn't understand that unprotected intercourse brings about children because the first child did come. By then it was the mid-1900s, so with respect to little knowledge on contraceptives at the time, I guess one can't go too hard on him and his wife because mistakes do happen, right? Well, the child was conceived by some miracle because Clark reportedly physically abused his wife while she was pregnant with this child. So much so that Irene had to go to the hospital, which is also around the time she was due to give birth. Despite this, Dorothy Wiley was born on the 2nd of June 1948 as a healthy little girl, but much to the dismay of Clark, who, as expected, found the baby very annoying and noisy. So irritating that at some point as the child was crying, he wrapped it in a blanket, put it in the home's garage and left it there for an extended period of time. As a result, the baby died. The exact cause of death wasn't identified but suspected to be exposure. Dorothy was only 2 months old at the time of her death. It feels wrong to say it this way, but now that Clark was practically free of the noise a baby makes, you'd figure that he and his wife would stop making children, right? I mean, the first one must have been a mistake on their part as parents, right? On the 15th of September 1949, a little over a year after the death of their last child, Clark and Irene welcomed their second born and they named him Robert Wiley. Robert would also unfortunately die just days later. Some sources say due to a birth defect, others say he choked on his own mucus and it was in a way Clark's fault, while others say it was due to blood poisoning because the parents were incompatible. The last one makes more sense, as we shall see later on. 3 years after this, Irene and Clark would welcome a third child on March 11th, 1952, whom they named John Wiley. John would actually be the first child to survive past infancy, although he was said to be slow to develop due to severe neglect during early childhood. He was slow to walk and was not potty trained by 3 years old. Clark Wiley's mother, who was now back in his life, chose to take care of John when he was 4 years old. This is because, along with the neglect, Clark was still physically abusing his wife, so that environment was not good for John, whom she figured would probably meet the same fate as his older siblings if she didn't step in. This act was very crucial to John's development as he later went on to become a normal child and adult. While John was living with his paternal grandmother, Irene and Clark made another child, who would be their last. Susan Wiley, or Genie, was born on the 18th of April 1957, 5 years after John. Susan had complications during her birth. Doctors found that she had blood poisoning but was luckily saved by a blood transfusion. Hence, I said the blood poisoning theory regarding Robert's death made more sense. Although the blood transfusion saved her life, her first medical exam reports described her as slow and a retarded girl with kernicterus, which is when a botched blood transfusion brings about brain damage. This medical report would influence Clark's later abuse of the little girl. 20 months after the birth of Susan, Clark Wiley's mother was killed by a drunk driver, dragging her body down the street. You'd think that, after all the pain she caused Clark, he wouldn't have been affected much by her sudden death. But shockingly, it seemed to actually do the opposite. It turns out that later on in his life, Clark had become extremely close to his mother. Irene even later described her mother-in-law as a pest. She said his mother never became more than a secondary allegiance in his life. His mother's death was so violent that she was unrecognizable by the time Clark got to see her body at the hospital. Those close to the man said that her death was the event which turned him into the monster that we know him today. It didn't help much that the teen who killed his mother was only given probation, something which made Clark feel that society had failed him. He then decided that he won't let it take anybody else from him and resorted to isolation. He reportedly quit his job, moved with his family to his mother's 2-bedroom house in Temple City, Los Angeles, and cut off most contact between his family and the outside world. John was only allowed to leave the house to go to school and to play with the neighbor's kid. He started to become much angrier than before, so much so that he told his wife and son to whisper when talking because he hated any form of noise. To enforce this, he would sit in the living room with a gun on his lap. His mother's bedroom was kept as a shrine for her, while 20-month-old Susan was moved into the other bedroom at the back, not allowed to leave the room, separated from society. The rest of the family slept in the living room. After learning about the medical report from earlier, Clark concluded that Susan was mentally disabled. He deduced that his daughter would never be able to fend for herself, so he took it upon himself to keep the child away from the same vicious society that snatched his mother away from him, without any justice. Even her own mother and brother weren't allowed to interact with Susan, who would spend most of her days tied naked to a potty chair, only able to move her hands and feet. At night, she would be put into a straitjacket-like sleeping bag and sleep in a crib made into a makeshift cage by the chicken wire enclosing it on top. The room was dark as the curtains were kept closed. She was fed baby food, a soft boiled egg at times, and cereal. If she were to spit up the food or choke, her face would be rubbed in it. Only words said to this child were "stop it" or "no more" and some other negative words. Whenever she made noise, as a child does, Clark would beat her until she stopped. She would then keep increasingly quiet over time until she suppressed vocalization completely. Father hit arm, big wood, Genie cry, not spit, father hit face, spit, father hit big stick, father is angry, father hit Genie big stick, father take piece would hit, cry, father make me cry. He would also bark or growl like a dog outside her door to scare her and keep her quiet, which in the end instilled a lifelong fear of such animals within Susan. Some professionals who worked with Susan later on believed that she may have also been sexually abused by her father due to the unusual sexual behavior she exhibited. John Wiley was also abused by his father, but it was Susan who suffered the most. All of this occurred for almost 13 years. Why didn't Irene intervene with all of this abuse happening just in front of her? She probably feared that Clark would kill her if she went to the police, and her being mostly blind wasn't helping either. Around October 1970, Clark left the house to buy groceries, and after more than a decade of putting up with all the abuse, Irene finally decided to leave Clark and go live with her parents. She took Susan along, who was leaving the house for the very first time since they moved there. On the 4th of November 1970, Susan and her mother went to apply for disability benefits for Irene's blindness at the Temple City offices where they give aid to the blind. Note that Irene was 90% blind in one eye and 100% in the other. Therefore, after arriving at these offices, Irene's blindness caused them to accidentally stumble into the social welfare office as they mistook it for the office where they help the blind. The social worker working in this office was immediately fixated on Susan and wondered why this little girl, who looked about 6 to 8 years old, was acting so strange and hopping like a bunny instead of walking. She described Susan as a small withered girl with a halting gait and a curious posture, unnaturally stooped, hands held up as though resting on an invisible rail. The employees thought this was an unreported case of autism and contacted the authorities. Susan was taken away and treated for extreme malnutrition. A case of abuse was immediately opened against Clark and Irene.
Mr. Wiley?
Yes.
Why did you keep your daughter in a room?
Mr. Wiley has no comment.
No comment.
We haven't had time to discuss.
In a shocking twist of events, Clark would take his own life just minutes before the court hearing on the 20th of November 1970.
Genie's parents were both charged with willful abuse. 15 minutes before he was due in court, her father put a gun to his head.
He was 70 years old at the time and left behind a note that read, "The world will never understand." As for Irene, the abuse charges against her were eventually dropped when she revealed how she was also being abused by her husband and how her blindness didn't make things easier. Susan Wiley became a ward of the state, which basically means she was now under the protection of the government. Her guardian by law was a woman from the Department of Social Services, Sue Omansky. Sue was tasked with finding Susan a new home with more suitable parents. In the meantime, she was placed in the UCLA Children's Hospital. A psychologist by the name of James Kent described her as the most profoundly damaged child I've ever seen. Genie's life is a wasteland. Her case was discovered by scientists who wanted to study her abnormal development, and therefore a team was formed and awarded a grant to do so by the National Institution for Mental Health. Her case got so popular that this is when her name had to be changed to protect her identity. Hence, the psychologist referred to her as Genie instead of Susan. Genie's team consisted mainly of 4 professionals, each from different fields tasked with studying her development. The aforementioned James Kent, an expert on child abuse, and Susan Curtis, a linguistics graduate student at UCLA, along with Jay Shirley, an expert on social isolation, and David Rigler, a psychologist at the Children's Hospital, were part of this team. So, why was Genie's case so important that even a team of professionals were tasked with studying her? While Genie was sort of a natural experiment which they figured would help them answer the many questions posed in terms of what occurs during development, she was the rare case they could use because in the research field, it would be unethical to subject people to the same conditions that Genie grew up in on purpose in a bid to study them. Our morality doesn't allow us to conduct deprivation experiments with human beings. These unfortunate people are all we have to go on. The team decided to explore the developmental consequence of extreme social isolation. However, their goal was also to help Genie explore the world and help her adjust to it. The task of studying her while also helping her integrate into society were two adverse goals which would later come to harm the Genie team and even Genie herself. At the hospital, Genie began to learn how to dress herself and use the toilet, but she was still incontinent. After 2 weeks at the hospital, the researchers felt that she was ready to go outside into the play area along with other children. James Kent would then take daily walks with her and sometimes take her to the park so she could get used to the outside world and learn to explore it. Genie loved these walks so much that she started showing genuine happiness whenever Kent arrived. At some point, even holding his hand when it was time for him to leave because she would miss him. When she saw that this didn't work, she would sit beside him in a bed to prevent him from leaving. She enjoyed his presence and formed a special bond with the man. Even though she was starting to get exposed to the other children at the hospital, the researchers noticed that Genie mostly preferred to form attachments with bearded men, just like Kent. Kent didn't mind this though, as he saw it from a different perspective. In his mind, it would be best for Genie's condition if she could form meaningful relationships with people. He would feed her breakfast and even read her bedtime stories. He even let her break some stuff she wasn't supposed to, without repercussion, and even encouraged her to repeat the action. He noticed that this made Genie laugh and smile. When the hospital staff expressed their worry in the sense that Genie would soon become destructive and naughty because of this, Kent quickly reassured them that that won't be the case. This has to happen because Genie was achieving mastery over previously traumatic situations. This also helped Genie in the expression of her anger, something which she struggled to do before. She would throw objects and make noises which she previously wasn't allowed to make during her early childhood. Kent's actions show us that he was also starting to show fondness for Genie, something he himself noticed but said, doctors aren't supposed to love their patients. Jay Shirley would monitor Genie's brain with electrodes while she slept to see whether there was any reason to do research on her in the first place. If she was mentally disabled, there would be no need to study her cognitive development. The results showed that Genie had abnormal brain waves, which led Shirley to conclude that she must have experienced some sort of brain damage at birth. But some of the other researchers, including Susan Curtis, didn't accept that theory. Throughout her testing, Genie showed wonderful improvements, something that mentally challenged people did not. Shirley also noticed that upon her arrival, Genie acted similarly to a blind person. She would touch people's faces to feel them as though a blind person would, and would walk with her hands almost stretched out in front of her as someone who had very poor vision would. This explained the placement of her arms during the bunny walk. You cannot achieve sensory isolation without social isolation. For an intact, developed human being, the richest source of sensory contact is input from a fellow human being. Solitary confinement is diabolically the most severe punishment, and in my experience, really quite dramatic symptoms develop in as little as 15 minutes to an hour, and certainly inside of 2 or 3 days. And try to expand this to 10 years boggles one's mind. Genie was also curious about naming objects. She would become angry if someone didn't immediately tell her the name of an object which she was pointing at. Another instance where she showed her improvement was when a little boy who also stayed at the hospital was asked how many balloons he had. He was holding 2 balloons, but he incorrectly said 3. This appeared to unsettle Genie, so she gave the boy another balloon so he could indeed have 3 balloons. She had a way of connecting with people and reaching out without saying anything. She indeed was making remarkable progress, with some researchers even saying that she was gaining a year's worth of development every few months. Susan Curtis was another researcher who developed a close bond with Genie. She spent most of her time with the little girl and even noticed that Genie enjoyed communicating non-verbally. She was not retarded, it was clear as day, her lights were on. Linguists of the time believed that children could no longer learn language once they reached puberty at 13 years old like Genie. Curtis believed that Genie could disprove this theory. Genie formed relationships with hospital staff, including the rehabilitation therapist Jean Butler. In 1971, Butler received permission from Genie's guardian, Omansky, to take Genie home with her on some nights as she was also her language teacher. She found that Genie was fascinated by buckets and enjoyed collecting containers which were able to store liquid, a common trait among previously socially isolated individuals. Genie made a breakthrough during a session with Butler. Butler told her, "You tie your shoe and then you can tell Dr. Kent what you can do." It wasn't clear whether Genie understood the full sentence, but after hearing this, she started repeating the word doctor, which excited researchers and the teacher as they began to wonder whether Genie's language skills could one day fully recover. At some point, however, Butler claimed that she had caught rubella, also known as German measles, as there was a measles outbreak at the time, and requested to be temporarily quarantined along with Genie. Her request was granted, and so Genie went to practically live at Butler's home. Kent, Curtis, and Shirley would often visit Genie while she was in quarantine. Genie was already used to spending some nights at the place, so the transition wasn't too much on her. In fact, it seemed like she actually enjoyed being at Butler's home. Butler soon discovered that Genie's physical development was catching up as she was now beginning puberty, a wonderful discovery which showed that her health was getting better. With puberty, however, came along Genie's fascination with pleasuring herself. Lacking manners and proper social skills, Genie would perform this act anywhere in the house, around anyone, and of course, it was a problem. Butler later went on to say that James Kent encouraged this behavior because, just like earlier when she kept breaking stuff at the hospital, he didn't want to confine her. However, when asked about this later on, Kent claimed Butler was lying. Butler would also start getting irritated by the frequent visits of the Genie team, especially Curtis, since she spent a lot of time with Genie, even taking her shopping at times. In her journal, she wrote, "She followed the child and hovered over her most of the day. She had a notebook handy and discussed Genie's speech and the lack of it, and her eating habits in a critical manner in front of her." On a certain day during Genie's stay, David Rigler, not knowing about Genie's fear of dogs thanks to her father's growling, brought a puppy along with him when going to visit Genie. He then led Genie outside and she saw the puppy, which caused her to run back inside the house in terror. She could only look at the dog through the window and never wanted to go any closer. After Rigler left, Genie is said to have stayed in her bed for 2 hours, using the bathroom frequently during the time, which is a sign of fear for her, and she kept repeating "no dog" and "scared" all night. These actions by the researchers, along with how many times they came and tested her during the day, eventually got too much for Butler, who started to decrease the amount of access they could have to Genie. Butler argued with the team, and it got so serious to the point that the team had to notify the Department of Public Social Services. In the meantime, Butler applied to become Genie's foster parent, which was denied because, as an employee of the Children's Hospital, the hospital had a policy which prevented its employees from adopting any children admitted to the hospital. Due to Butler's lack of cooperation with the team and also upon hearing of her adoption application, David Rigler wrote Butler a 10-page letter explaining that although she might probably make a good foster parent, the financial cost of taking care of Genie full-time would be too much for her, along with some other things. Some of the researchers even said that Butler wanted to become the next Anne Sullivan. All of this commotion led to Genie being sent back to the Children's Hospital. Rigler saw this as an opportunity to take care of Genie himself with his family, and so told the department that if no other home could be found for the girl, that they will take care of her. The Department of Public Social Services allowed this to happen, and so Genie went on to live with Rigler, his wife, and their 3 kids for the next 4 years. His wife became Genie's new teacher, replacing Butler. The funny thing is, Rigler was also an employee at the Children's Hospital. Therefore, didn't the same policy which denied Butler the foster parent status apply to him as well? Why did Genie stay with the man and his family for so long? It is unclear why the Department of Public Social Services allowed this to happen. With Genie now living with him, it gave the Genie team more access to Genie, but something wasn't right. Susan Curtis claimed that Genie's language development was not progressing anymore. Genie was still using 2 to 3 word sentences and often putting multiple words into one. For example, Monday Curtis come turned into Monko. Genie could also now answer questions, but she still couldn't ask them. When she was forced to do so, her grammar was bad. She would ask things like, where is may I have a penny? And where is Graham cracker on top shelf? This might seem like nothing to you and me. I mean, she was communicating at least, right? But the researchers were disappointed because they expected her to know how to construct grammatically correct sentences at that point. It seemed as though her verbal language development had just stopped. Maybe this was as good as it got. However, Genie's non-verbal communication was still improving greatly though, as David taught her sign language. Genie also loved communicating through drawings. Someone had to meet the demands of research and someone had to meet Genie's therapeutic needs, and I had both roles. One day, while looking through a magazine, Genie came across a picture of a wolf which caused her to freeze and she couldn't talk. When the Riglers asked Genie's mother what the matter was, she revealed her husband's practice of barking and growling at Genie outside her door. Jay Shelley tried to make sense of Clark's bizarre growling in his book, where he wrote, "All I can think is that it had to do with Clark's appointing himself his daughter's guardian. He was going to protect Genie from the world, and at the same time, he was punishing her with his protection. And people are often guarded by their dogs, so he became a dog." Rigler finally understood why the dog made Genie so terrified when he had brought it to Butler's home earlier, so he tried to help Genie get over her fear. He used exposure therapy to get Genie used to the puppy. At first, she would only look at it through the sliding door, but after a while, she even got comfortable enough to touch the dog's tail. The Riglers then noticed how crucial it was for them to involve Irene in their rehabilitation of Genie, so they did. The Riglers would take Genie to see her mother on weekends, which made both Genie and Irene happy. Irene was able to undergo surgery to get her cataracts removed, and so these visits allowed her to see how grown Genie was as a teenager. Irene was a bit shy in front of the researchers though, and would often take Genie into a room where she could hug her in private. The year was now 1973 and Jean Butler was back. She pointed out how Genie's progress had actually declined since her move to the Riglers' home, and also said that the Riglers were reporting false results to the National Institute for Mental Health. They said she learned new things during their care, such as dressing herself and setting the table, which was false because she already knew how to do these things before moving there. Despite what he said earlier about meeting the demands of research, Rigler had actually failed to do so because his research was described as disorganized and anecdotal. The National Institute for Mental Health stopped funding the study in 1974, with the review committee arguing that very little progress has been made and that the research goals probably won't be realized. Rigler conceded and admitted that it was hard to evaluate the study, but also said that the reviewers simply did not understand the situation. The study wasn't like most scientific studies. There were no controls. It's a study of a single case, and those are rare. They are anecdotal. They can't be in the way of normal science. There was pressure on me to be much more scientific in my approach. Measurements, that's what they wanted. Not that I didn't want to make measurements, but I didn't want to do so in ways that would be intrusive to the well-being of the kid. I was never able to satisfy people on the committee that I was doing this in the best way for science and for the child. So, on the one side we have Butler, who claimed to have denied the Genie team much access to Genie because they were conducting too many tests on her and treating her like a lab rat. She didn't like the research strategies of certain members within the team, and she explained her actions as nothing but wanting the best for Genie. On the other side, we have Rigler, who admits that his research was anecdotal, but that's just how things are supposed to be if one is to protect the well-being of the child. Both of these people's intentions were to protect Genie, but in this pursuit, they hindered the study from reaching its goals. As I said earlier, the task of studying her while also helping her integrate into society are two adverse goals which would later come to harm the Genie team and even Genie herself. The Genie team was harmed as their study could no longer continue. Without the funding from the National Institute, they had to disband. Genie would live with the Riglers only until 1975, when she was sent back to live with her mother. She was now 18. Genie only lived with her mother for a few months until Irene realized that she couldn't take care of Genie. I don't think it's because she didn't want to. She probably didn't have the necessary resources to help her continue to develop into a well-functioning adult. Exactly what Rigler warned Butler about. This is where things start going south for Genie. She was moved to a foster home by the East Los Angeles Regional Center for the Developmentally Disabled. From there, she was moved from one foster home to another, never really finding a stable home. And as you can probably imagine, this was extremely distressing for her. With every move, she got increasingly confused and traumatized. She felt that she was being moved around because she was being a bad girl. At one foster home, Genie was suffering from constipation. The parent attempted to resolve this by manually extracting the feces using an ice cream stick. An event which left Genie so traumatized that she reportedly didn't speak for 5 months. Another foster home would punish Genie for vomiting and threatened they wouldn't allow her to see her mother, whom she was very attached to at that point. Curtis and Rigler were aware of how Genie was being treated and tried to help, but to no avail. All of this and some other occurrences, which were probably not revealed to the public, caused Genie's progress she made with the team to regress and was soon hospitalized. She now refused to open her mouth to eat nor to speak, so some of the other things done to her within those foster homes went unknown. Genie missed the Riglers, especially Marilyn. She also missed her mother.
So now you're keeping your mouth closed so you won't vomit.
At the time, Curtis was the only constant presence in Genie's life, which wasn't quite enough because she also had to focus on her dissertation and writing her book. At some point, even she wasn't allowed access to Genie any longer. After Curtis's book about Genie was published, Irene read it and became enraged. In 1979, Genie's mother filed a lawsuit against the Genie team, the hospital, and those who were tasked to take care of Genie at the hospital, alleging that they exploited her daughter for prestige and profit. She accused the researchers of subjecting Genie to extreme, unreasonable, and outrageous intensive testing, experimentation, and observation under conditions of duress and servitude. She thought that the only way Curtis was able to find the type of information she did in her book was through intensive testing and experiments. Irene lost this lawsuit because the researchers argued that Genie enjoyed the research, and her own curiosity and love for learning encouraged her progress and development. The outcome of the suit was obviously not what Irene had hoped for, and so she was still angry. She took Genie back and moved her to a home for mentally disabled adults and visited her once a month until Irene passed away in 2003. The former members of the Genie team have tried reaching out to Genie with no luck. In a 2008 interview, Curtis revealed how she's tried reaching out to Genie. I'm pretty sure she's still alive because I've asked each time I called and they told me she's well. They never let me have any contact with her. I've become powerless in my attempts to visit her or to write to her. I think my last contact was in the early 1980s. She also said that she spent the last 20 years looking for her. I can get as far as the social worker in charge of her case, but I can't get any further. What Irene originally thought was a book used for riches and prestige was actually used to help Genie. Susan Curtis said she put all the royalties the book generated into a trust fund for Genie. Curtis was very fond of Genie, and this was apparent many times during the study, especially when Butler said how annoyed she was of Curtis's closeness to Genie. I'd give up my job. I'd change careers to see her again. Jay Shirley said he last saw Genie on her 27th and 29th birthdays and described her as silent, depressed, and chronologically institutionalized. Journalists have also tried to know more about Genie's story. One, Ras Raima, wanted to find out more about the disbanding of the Genie team and what caused it, but later admitted how challenging it was because of the divided opinions from the researchers. The tremendous rift complicated my reporting. That was also part of the breakdown that turned her treatment into such a tragedy. He also visited Genie on her 27th birthday and reported seeing a large bumbling woman with facial expressions of cow-like incomprehension. Her eyes focused poorly on the cake. Her dark hair has been hacked off regularly at the top of her forehead, giving her the aspect of an asylum inmate. Her exact whereabouts are currently unknown, but with what I've read, I have full confidence that she's still in a foster home somewhere in Los Angeles as a ward of the state. I am a living dead man. Everybody was so busy with Genie and focusing on her that nobody asked, "How's John?" I was left out in left field and no one came to my rescue. I'm sure even you yourself had already forgotten about John, right? There are some lesser known details about what happened to John during this whole time, but before we get to that, let's talk about the time John was taken by his grandmother before Genie was born. One day, John and Clark's mother went to buy some ice cream, but on their way there, John stood helplessly and watched a car hit and run over his grandmother, killing her instantly. Yes, John was there when his grandmother was killed. She was walking with him and his life was spared. But Clark wasn't as relieved when he heard the news. Instead, he blamed the 6-year-old boy for his mother's death. On an interview later on in his life, he revealed how Clark made him sleep on the floor after they moved into his grandmother's house. He would also be beaten at times, especially on his crotch area. It seemed as though Clark was a bit jealous of his son's manhood, and so he would tie John's legs to a chair and then beat him on his testicles using the same board or stick he beat Genie with whenever she cried. I don't think he wanted me to have children, and it's a wonder I did. He would write me a note excusing me from gym so the kids didn't see my privates in the showers. When Genie was discovered by the authorities, 18-year-old John had apparently run away from the home due to the abuse. He was a total dictator in the house. His word was law. Hitler could have taken lessons from him. By the time his father took his own life, I think John was back at the house because he recounted the time it occurred as him being in the backyard of the house with his friend when they both heard a gunshot coming from inside the house. Something else which you might not have known is that when Clark did this, he left 3 notes behind instead of 1. The first note was directed to the police, telling them that John was in the yard outside and didn't know what was about to happen, therefore ruling out any suspicion as to whether it was self-inflicted or not. The second note was for John. "Don't take that shirt back. It's for my funeral. You know where my blue shirt is. Underwear in hall closet. I love you. Goodbye and be good. Dad." He left out clothes on the bed which he had decided were to be for his funeral, which is what he is referring to in the letter. He also left $400 on the bed for John. The third note was the infamous "The world will never understand." I have forgiven but I can't forget. My house was like a concentration camp. I never knew what normal was. After this, it is said that he moved in with his maternal grandparents for a while, then lived with some friends before returning back to the family home. He then went on a cross-country trip, taking some odd jobs here and there. At some point, he was working at a gas station and then went on to construction. I had to learn about life when I got on my own, away from my family. He struggled with alcohol abuse, divorce, and was eventually disconnected from his daughter. He got married for 17 years and had a daughter, even though, just like his father, he didn't want any children. I was afraid to have kids because of my upbringing. His daughter apparently got addicted to cocaine to numb the pain from her own personal problems, and John says he doesn't see much of his 2 young grandchildren. John also spent 10 days in jail for stealing cars. He tried joining the Navy but was discharged only 6 months later. John has also survived a heart attack and at the time of the interview was a diabetic living in some Ohio farming town without medical insurance. John was as much a victim of the family dynamics as the younger sister was, but he was so little a part of the direction of the case. Unfortunately, we never really paid attention to him. The case comes back to haunt me. John said he last saw his sister in 1982. I tried to put Genie out of my mind because of the shame, but I'm glad she got some help. When you are a kid, you try to trust my parents. I think I trusted the wrong people. They didn't give me the tools, the knowledge about accomplishments and setting goals and the Bible and God. I feel at times God failed me. Maybe I failed him, but it's never too late. John passed away in February 2011. If you want to do rigorous science, then Genie's interests are going to come second some of the time. If you only care about helping Genie, then you wouldn't do a lot of scientific research. I think future generations are going to study Genie's case not only for what it can teach us about human development, but also for what it can teach us about the rewards and risks of conducting the forbidden experiment.